Hello everyone and welcome to the tutorial for the Crochet Confetti Cardigan. You can see here that I have a whole bunch of real fancy yarn. In case you weren't already aware, I, Sorella, started a hand-dyed yarn business along with my husband called Handmade Home Fibers, and that's where all of this yarn is from. So I dyed all of this myself. I sell it over on handmadehomefibers.com. It's really great yarn. It's really lush. I even have a crocheter's base that's completely hand-picked by me for crocheters. I know a lot of hand-dyed yarn is very heavily marketed toward knitters, but I really wanted to create a yarn just for crocheters that's really high quality and a nice treat for yourself. So getting started on this confetti cardigan, we're going to be using a K size hook, and I'm going to be using several skeins of this Handmade Home Fibers yarn. This is a DK or level 3 weight, category 3. You can sub out yarn from a big box store if you'd like to, or another hand-dyed yarn, but whatever you use, you're going to want to be able to meet the gauge that's listed in the pattern linked below. So just make sure that whatever yarn you use, Handmade Home Fibers or not, you can meet that gauge so that your sweater will fit. And at the link in the description box below, we have the full written pattern, so go ahead and make sure to click over there and grab the instructions for your size. I'm going to be making size medium, but the written pattern is sizes extra small all the way up to 3XL. So getting started here, I'm going to start with the back panel, and we're going to start with just a foundation chain. So I'm going to start with my main color. This sweater is striped. So we have a main color and a contrast color. We're going to start with the main color for size medium. I'm chaining 57. And this video is really to help walk you through the written pattern. It's not supposed to replace the written pattern. So I like to offer the visual aid to my readers, but please know that you do need the written pattern in order to follow this tutorial. So we're going to go ahead and half double crochet in the third chain from our hook. And we're going to keep half double crocheting in each stitch all the way across. So for me, working a size medium, I'm going to be half double crocheting all the way, and I should have 55 stitches at the end of row 1. This pattern is really simple. It's a very easy first wearable to make. It's all half double crochet, just back and forth over and over. So here I have row 1 done. We can see those beautiful pops of color. This colorway from Handmade Home Fibers is called macaron, or macaroon, however you pronounce it, depending on where you're from. And it's a really nice, softly speckled pastel colorway, but this pattern would look beautiful in lots of different colors of yarn. So we've chained up 2 and turned. We're going to half double crochet in that very first stitch and in each stitch across. We're just going to keep doing this, half double crochet in each stitch all the way across, back and forth. Depending on your size, it's going to vary how many rows you're doing of half double crochet and obviously how many stitches you have in each row, but I do have a handy stitch table over in the written pattern. It's not just a plain written pattern. I do have some extra tables and things for you to utilize if you are a visual learner like me and you need a little bit of help with reading written patterns. There is that help over there for you. So here I am finishing all the way to the end, half double crochet, chain 2 and turn. And I'm just going to keep going like this back and forth for the entire back panel. Again, depending on your size, you're going to work a different number of rows. You are also going to need to change color for your stripes, and I have a color change chart also over on the written pattern. It's hard to lay out all the numbers and all of kind of when you need to change color and all of that in a video without it taking 5 hours. So I laid it all out really in depth in the written pattern. And you can see here that I've changed color, and no matter what size you're making, you're only going to work 2 rows of the contrast color at a time. So it's going to make these really nice thin stripes. And if you choose a color that complements your base yarn or your main color, like I did here with this macaroon base speckled yarn, and then I chose kind of a plummy lavender color for the stripes, it's going to really create a nice kind of cohesive effect. So make sure to keep that in mind, or you can just work this in a solid color and don't pay any attention to the stripes. So now at this point I have my back panel done. I'm going to proceed onto the front panel without breaking the yarn. So I've worked all the way across my last row here. So for me working the size medium, I have worked up to row 53. And now I'm just going to work back and forth across about half of this row, and that's going to create my front panel. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to half double crochet in each of the next 26 stitches. So that's roughly about halfway across, leaving a couple of stitches that are going to be left open in the middle, and you'll see what I mean in a little while. So go ahead and just crochet. Again, this is going to change depending on what size you're working, but make sure to follow that written pattern. Size medium, we're working 26, and we're going to stop, and then we're going to turn our work, and we're just going to work back and forth across those 26 stitches until we have about the same length that we do for the back panel. And what that's going to do is it's just going to kind of fold over. Here you can see those 26 stitches. Now I'm going to leave this other side unworked. I'm just kind of counting to double check myself. So I should have 26 stitches coming in from the other side, and then I'm going to leave 3 unworked. But we're not going to work that yet. I'm just counting to make sure that I have the right number. Completely forget about this other side. Act like it doesn't exist. We'll come back to it later. So we're going to chain 2 and turn just like we did with the regular back panel. And we're going to work back across this way. And we're just going to keep continuing with that. Again, I have a color change stitch table chart over on the written pattern for the front panels as well. So it's going to tell you for your size how many rows of main color and then contrast color you need to work. And we're just doing regular half double crochets here. There's no shaping or anything yet. So don't worry about that, and just go ahead and work up your first front panel, just half double crocheting back and forth, paying attention to that color change chart to let you know when you need to change color. But it's fairly simple. So just go ahead and work up the rest of that first front panel, and it should look something like this. So for me, I've worked up basically the same thing I did on the back panel. It's just only about half the size. So I'm going to go ahead and finish off my yarn here, and you can see that I've kept consistent with the way that I changed color. It's all laid out for you in the written pattern, but you can see here that it matches the back panel. So if you follow all of those kind of line by line directions in the written pattern, your first front panel here that's attached to your back panel, remember we didn't break our yarn, it should match up perfectly. So basically now what we're going to do is we're going to rejoin our yarn to that same row that we left off the back panel where we began our front panel, our first front panel. We're going to join our yarn and keep crocheting our second front panel in the same manner that we did our first front panel. So right now our first front panel is looking great. Everything's matching up. Our stripes are lining up with the back panel when it's folded over like so. And now we just need to work this second one. And the way in which we're going to do that is we're going to work off of that last row of the back panel, just like we did for the first front panel. So here we have the back panel. Lay everything out nice and flat so you can see what you're doing. We've worked across this way, we stopped and we worked back and forth. Now what we're going to do is we're going to skip 3 stitches, or the number of stitches that it says to skip for your size. It'll be either 2 or 3 depending on your size. So go ahead and skip however many stitches you need to, and then we're going to rejoin our yarn. Make sure that you're working in the same direction as you did with your first front panel. So your first front panel should still be on the right side of things, the right hand side. If you're right-handed, if you're left-handed, all of this will be identical, but flipped the other way. So for my size medium, I'm skipping 3 stitches, and I'm going to join my yarn to that 4th stitch from where we left off on our first front panel. Again, I'm working in the same direction as my first row of the first front panel. So now we're going to chain up 2. Go ahead and tighten that yarn so it doesn't go anywhere. And now I'm going to go ahead and half double crochet into that same stitch that I joined the yarn. And then I'm just going to continue in each stitch to the end of the row. This time we don't really need to count. You should have the same number of stitches as your first front panel, so if you want to count to double check yourself that you have, in my case, 26 stitches here as well, you can. But we don't need to keep track of where to stop because we're just working to the end of the row, and we're going to work back and forth, same thing we did on the front panel. At this point now we can just work back and forth across, again following those color change instructions on the table in the written pattern. And we're just going to keep continuing. Make sure that when you work back toward the center area of your cardigan, you're stopping in the last stitch and not continuing on into those skipped stitches. So make sure you just work to here and chain 2 and turn. And now this is what we should be looking like with the second front panel finished. We have our first front panel, our second front panel. Everything's already attached nicely. We're going to go ahead and finish off our yarn. These edges should match up here over on the right hand side of your screen where your front panels both end. Everything should match up and be quite linear. You shouldn't have any kind of like leaning shapes. I did have to join on my last skein of macaroon, but we're going to be using that for the sleeves. All of the number of skeins and all of the information on the number of grams you're going to need and all of that is over at the link in the description box in the written pattern. So go ahead and fold these front panels over. Line everything up. And everything should match nicely. The stripes should line up. And also don't be afraid to get creative with your stripes. You don't necessarily have to do the striping the same way that I did. If you wanted to do thicker stripes or even uneven stripes, you could get wild with it and just go crazy and do all different kinds of striping that doesn't necessarily line up. And that could be really fun too. You can see here with the color changes that I did carry my yarn. And I'm going to hide that in the seam as best I can. If you want a absolutely perfectly clean seam with absolutely no contrast color showing, you're going to want to cut your yarn and weave as you go. But for me, I'm kind of fine with the tiny little imperfection of a little bit of this color showing. It hides fairly well with the seam technique that I'm going to use, so I don't worry too much about it, but that's just my personal preference. So go ahead and weave all of the ends that you have, all the loose ends of your main color and your contrast color. Make sure that you are weaving your ends over the same color. And now we're going to go ahead and start in on our sleeves. So our sleeves are worked apart from our main body. We're not going to work them off of the sweater. We're going to work them independently. So start with a foundation chain. I'm going to chain 28, and then I'm going to double crochet in the third chain from my hook and in each stitch all the way to the end. So I should have a total of 26 double crochets total. Again, in the written pattern, this is going to change size to size, and there's also a color change chart for you here on the sleeves. The sleeves are the only area where we're going to have any kind of shaping, and we're going to work from the bottom up. So what you see me working here is the ribbing around the cuff, and we're going to be just increasing every so many rows up to the top where we're going to sew it to the armhole. But we'll get there in just a few moments. So go ahead and chain up 2 at the end of your row. Go ahead and turn your work, and we're going to double crochet in the very first stitch, regular double crochet, and now this is where the ribbing comes into play. So we're going to front post double crochet around this next stitch. There are great videos on YouTube for how to work a front post double crochet if you're not sure how to do it. So there's our first front post, and now we're going to back post double crochet on the next stitch. And we're just going to alternate front and back post double crochet all the way across. Until you get to the last stitch. So you should have an even number here of front and back post double crochet. And once you get all the way across, you're going to just work one regular double crochet in the last stitch. The reason that we do it this way with a regular double crochet on each end is because when we go to seam up our sleeve, it's a lot easier to see where to sew it together and get a nice clean seam without those post stitches in the very beginning and end of our work. So you can see here what row 2 looks like finished. It's definitely looking more like ribbing. It's got a much more textured look. Again, we're just going to work a regular double crochet. We have our last front and back post stitches. Regular double crochet in the last stitch here. This is how it should be looking. Nice and textured. We're going to chain up 2 and turn. Chain 1 and turn. And we're just going to single crochet in each stitch across. So we really are only working one row of what is technically the ribbing. So just single crochet in each stitch across. This is just going to give a nice edge to the ribbing. Once we reach the end of row 3, we're going to be chaining up 2 and turning, and rows 4 through 15, no matter what size you're working, are going to be really simple. We're just going to half double crochet in each stitch across. But I am going to join my macaron yarn. So you'll see in the color chart for the sleeves that the first 3 rows, no matter what size you're making, are in our contrast color. So that lavender plum color are the first 3 rows of that ribbing. And then we're going to join our main color yarn, and we're going to just chain up 2, turn, and work half double crochets all the way across. We're going to go ahead and continue on with this for a total of 10 rows, or until we've completed row 15. Just regular 1 half double crochet in each stitch all the way across, and then we'll begin our shaping to make this into a sleeve. So you can see here that I've actually worked up to row 15, and I've worked my first stripe. So you can see I have 10 rows of the macaron color, and I have 2 rows of my contrast color. So now that I've finished that and I've finished row 15, I'm going to move on to row 16, where I chain 2 and turn. I'm going to work 2 half double crochets in the very first stitch. So a half double crochet increase is what that's called. So we're going to work 2 half double crochets in the very same stitch, that first stitch. So basically we're going to just work that increase in the very first stitch and then work regular half double crochets to the end of the row until we just have that one last stitch remaining. So we can see there what that should be looking like. And then in the last stitch of the row, we're also going to work 2 half double crochets in the same spot. So basically we're working an increase in the first stitch of the row and the last stitch of the row. Now this is going to be kind of how we work our quote-unquote increase row, and we're just going to repeat this method every so often. So basically here is row 16 all done with our increases at the beginning and end, regular half double crochets along the center. We're going to work regular half double crochets without increases for rows 17 and 18. So we have 2 rows of regular half double crochet, and then we're going to repeat this process all over again. So we do 1 row with those increases at the beginning and end, work 2 rows of regular half double crochet without increases. You can see here what that looks like now. We have our row of increases and our 2 rows of regular half double crochet, and then we're going to repeat this again. So we're going to work 2 half double crochets in the first. There's our increase. We're going to work regular half double crochets to the end, and we're going to increase again at the end. And we're going to keep repeating this all the way through row 39. So no matter what your size, you're going to work this increase sequence all the way until you finish row 39. You can see here how I'm finishing my second repetition of this increase. It's going to just kind of create a nice gradual sort of V shape with a nice increase to allow for nice comfortable sleeves that aren't too tight. You should see things start to flare out here on the sides a little bit as you go. And you're just going to keep repeating this, an increase row and 2 rows of regular half double crochet. Again, following that color change chart that you'll see in the written pattern. Make sure you're changing color when you need to within these repeats of the increase rows. So after we've finished all of our increases, we're just going to work regular half double crochets for a determined number of rows. We're not going to do any more increase rows. We're just going to do regular half double crochets until you've completed the number of rows appropriate for your size. For me, size medium, we're going to work up to row 49. You can see here kind of every 3 rows is an increase row, and that's kind of where you can see that things are flaring out a little bit, but with the way that this sequence is set up, it looks really nice and even. And you can see here now that I have all of my increase rows done. You can see how that flares out, and now I have my rows of regular half double crochet are all done as well, and my sleeve is finished. So I've finished row 49 of the sleeve, and it's all done, and you can see what it should look like. Now at this point I need to attach it to the body of my cardigan. Now the way in which I'm going to do that is I'm going to lay this flat, and I'm going to line it up with kind of the center of my sleeve. So if I fold that over and mark where the stitch is in the middle, or count from each side into where the center is, I'm going to line that up with that row where I joined my yarn for my second front panel. So you can kind of see there where the front panel begins and the back panel ends. I'm going to use some stitch markers to lay everything in place nicely. This should also line up with a stripe, kind of. You can see where the edge lines up with one of those stripes. I'm going to cut a long piece of spare yarn that matches the color that I'm sewing onto, and I'm just going to sew with a mattress stitch. So I'll zoom in here a little bit so I can show you how I'm doing this. I'm just going to join my yarn, and I'm going to sew with a simple whip stitch. So that's kind of the most basic joining technique that there is. Here on the shoulder seams, or where we're seaming our sleeve to the body, I'm going to use a whip stitch. I'm going to use a different stitch when I'm sewing up the sides, but I'll get to that in a minute. So just go ahead and whip stitch around. If you need a more in-depth tutorial on how to do a whip stitch, there are lots of great ones on YouTube. So I'm just working through each stitch of the sleeve, the last row of my sleeve, and also along the rough edge of my body, the back and front panels there. And just going nice and slow, making sure that everything's lining up nicely and I'm not pulling at either piece of fabric to kind of stretch it and make it fit in any which way. I want things to be nice and flat and relaxed so that when I wear this, everything drapes nicely and I don't have any weird bunching or stretching happening. So just go ahead and sew all the way along. When you're working over that contrast color, just kind of work as best you can to make even stitches. Try not to sew big long stitches that are really noticeable. Just kind of stitch into the edge there and just finish this all the way along. Now once we get to the end, we're just going to kind of weave our end, and we're going to work a separate piece of yarn to work our side seam. So now that our sleeve is attached, we're going to want to kind of reconfigure how this is laying and fold it in a different manner. So we're going to want to grab those front and back panels and kind of pull up from the center there. And we can kind of shape where the shoulder is. And now this is looking a lot more like a sweater, isn't it? We're going to line up those front and back panels. And then we're going to fold this sleeve over. So basically we're folding our sleeve in half lengthwise to create what looks like a regular sleeve. Now all of this is unjoined. I haven't seamed up the side of my cardigan yet. And now you can see here how it should be looking. So now I have basically this whole opening, the whole side of the body of the cardigan is open, as well as the underside of the sleeve. So I'm going to just cut a big, huge, long piece of yarn, or you can use several smaller pieces of yarn. And I'm going to start here at the very beginning of my sleeve, which was that foundation chain, and I'm going to kind of work in and out. I'm using a mattress stitch here, which once again, if you need help with how to work a mattress stitch more in detail and closer up, you can look that up on YouTube. There's lots of great videos. But basically you're going to stitch as if you're tying a shoelace, always working from the inside toward the outside. So always inserting your needle between the two pieces of fabric and working toward the outside. Or if you have another seaming technique that you prefer, if you'd like to use a whip stitch, that's totally fine too. However you want to secure this together is great. Make sure that you're matching up your stripes, because it's going to be really noticeable if your stripes don't match, especially along the sleeve, because you don't want your inner arm area to have crooked stripes. And that's true as well on the body of the cardigan, because your stripes are going to be matching up from front to back. So go ahead and just work all the way along the underarm area, working carefully in each stitch. We're going to be working the rough edge all along this whole side seam, so make sure that you're kind of matching up your rows, making sure to stitch through every row. Don't skip any. It's going to cause gapping and just general unpleasantness. Once you get to this underarm area, we're just going to kind of work all the way to the underarm and then begin stitching down the side seam. Make sure that you don't skip that underarm area or you'll have a nice hole right at the side seam in your underarm, which is very unpleasant. So just go ahead and make sure you work all the way down. And I'm going to work all the way to the hemline, to the very end of this cardigan. Once I get all the way down there, I'm going to weave my ends. I'm going to repeat this whole process on the other side. And here now you can see I have 2 completed sleeves that are joined and seamed. All my ends are woven, and the end is in sight for this cardigan. It's looking almost done. We just have to do the ribbing along the neckline and the hemline. I'm going to be using my main color, or that macaroon kind of confetti looking color, for my ribbing. You could certainly use your contrast color yarn. For me, creating the kits for this design, I needed to stick within the yarn requirements, and I had to join that 5th skein of the macaroon yarn for my last front panel, and I had to use it for my sleeves. And I still have a good amount of that color left, so that's what I'm going to use for my ribbing. You could definitely use your contrast color though if you're using a more affordable yarn or you just have more of that color hanging around. It's really up to you, but I used my main color for the ribbing. It does add a bit of yardage, but it really seems to fit nicely around the neck, more comfortable, and it just adds a really nice finishing touch. So this is about how much of the macaroon I have left of that last skein. This is how much of my contrast color I have left, just for reference, and that's just all going to be set aside. I'm not continuing with any of that for the rest of the sweater, so I have a nice amount of scrap yarn for another project. So I'm going to start with a slip knot. So go ahead and make a slip knot in whatever color yarn you're going to use for your ribbing. Tighten it down onto your hook and then kind of remove it. I'm going to join my yarn to this corner here. I'm going to start on the right side corner, and that's the right side as if you were wearing the cardigan. If you're left-handed, you're going to want to start on the left side. Go ahead and join your yarn and chain up 2 right there where that kind of corner turns, and we're going to double crochet in the very same stitch. And then we're going to double crochet in the next stitch, which is kind of like right at the tip of the corner. We're going to double crochet again in that same stitch right there at the corner where things kind of turn to go up the neckline. I'm going to turn this so it's a little easier to work with. So I have 2 double crochets there at that corner, and then I'm going to double crochet in each stitch evenly up this neckline, which is the rough edge of my front panel. So you're going to be working into the ends of the rows, not into the actual like tops of the stitches. So for me, because this is all half double crochet rows that I'm working into, I'm going to be working double crochet stitches just once into the edge of each row. So if you can identify where each of those individual rows are, just make 1 double crochet into the end of each row. So you can see here how that should be looking. If you're getting any kind of ruffling happen after you work up this neckline, that means you have too many stitches. You need to do fewer stitches, evenly spaced. And if you're getting a lot of puckering and kind of like bunching happening, that means that you don't have enough stitches, and you're going to want to work up some more along the neckline. When you're working into those contrast color stripes, also try to be as even as possible, just like with the shoulder seams. And when you're working over that yarn that got carried up the side, make sure that you're stitching over that yarn. And this is kind of how it should be looking. We're just going to work all the way up here to those 3 skipped stitches at the top. And when we get to this area, we're going to double crochet into the spot right before those 3 skipped stitches. You can see that there's kind of an opening where you go from the rough edge to those 3 skipped stitches. We're going to work a double crochet right there, work a double crochet into each of those 3 skip stitches, and there's the third one. There's the 3 skips. You can see I worked into that kind of opportunity right before. You can see here I'm going to work into this opportunity right after the 3 skipped stitches before I work into the edge, the rough edge of my other front panel. And then you're just going to keep crocheting evenly along the other side of your neckline, but this is what it should be looking like. You should have a nice rounded neckline, a nice kind of narrow U shape, and then just go ahead and continue on all the way down the other side of your neckline, evenly spacing your double crochets one into the end of each row. And when you get down to the bottom, you're going to work all the way down here. When you get down to the bottom, after you've come around this kind of U shape of the neckline, you're going to work another 2 double crochets right here in the corner, just like we did at the beginning. And then we're just going to work all the way around the hemline in one continuous round. You will have those kind of seam areas along the side that you worked together, but you're just going to work continually in every available stitch all the way around the hemline. And here we are after finishing that. We've come back to where we started with that chain 2. We're going to slip stitch to join. And now the first round of our hemline ribbing is done. We're going to chain 2. We're not going to turn our work, we're just going to work around in the same manner. And after our chain 2, we're going to start with our ribbing. So the same ribbing method we used on the cuff of our sleeve, we're going to front post double crochet in the first stitch. So there's our front post. This should match again our ribbing on the cuff of our sleeve, and then back post double crochet in the next stitch. In those corners, we did work 2 double crochets in the same spot on the first round, but we're not going to do that moving forward because we really don't need to. I like to have that nice rounded edge on my sweater. If you wanted to work extra stitches here, you could, but I prefer to just leave it alone. And just go ahead and keep alternating front and back post double crochets. And we're just going to continue with this all the way around our neckline and the hemline. We're working in one big round now because we aren't working over any rough edges. Now we have nice clean stitches to work into. So just go ahead and keep alternating front and back post double crochet all the way around. And here in round 2 is when we really start to see the ribbing take shape and we really start to see that great texture. We're going to be repeating round 2 again for rounds 3 and 4, but once we finish round 2 and we get back to where we started, you can see here how the ribbing should be looking, creating that nice texture around the edging. We get back to where we started and we're going to slip stitch to join to that beginning chain 2. And then we're going to chain 2 once again, and we're going to repeat round 2 with our alternating front and back post double crochets for rounds 3 and 4. But I do want to mention that you should always start with a front post double crochet, and your front post should always be stitched on front post and your back post should be stitched on back post. So your front and back post double crochets should never alternate. They should always be lining up with what is in the row below. That's what's going to create a nice linear ribbing, and it's not going to look like a basket weave pattern. If you have what looks like a basket weave pattern, that means that you're accidentally working your front and back posts in the wrong order. So go ahead and alternate front and back post all the way around rounds 3 and 4. And once we've finished that and we have a few more rounds of our ribbing, we're just going to, again, always slip stitch to join at the end of our round. And then after that, we'll just work one nice even round of single crochet in each stitch all the way around to nicely finish off this ribbing. And then your sweater is all done. So just go ahead and finish up this ribbing. After round 4, you're just going to work a regular single crochet in each stitch all the way around to nicely finish it off. And then after that, your sweater is all done and ready to wear. Give it a nice steam to help those stitches relax. And if you haven't yet checked out Handmade Home Fibers, please give us a shout, look us up on Instagram, and check out our website. We have lots of beautiful yarns and I'm so excited to share them with you. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy this free pattern. Bye-bye.